Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this question and answer session on Common Accommodations. We are joined by the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Dr. Amy Fisk, as well as Kelleigh Larson, who is serving as an intern in the office. Right now, Kelleigh is a graduate student at the University of Buffalo, as well as a Geneseo graduate. So with that, I will turn it over to Amy. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. We'll be talking about some common accommodations that may come across your way in your classrooms and hopefully providing some clarification, being able to answer some questions that you might have, and providing a few recommendations and strategies on how we can accommodate and support our students. So again, this is meant to be an informational presentation. We'll have the opportunity to ask questions and get clarification. If you have additional concerns or thoughts about certain accommodations, we can certainly address those at another time. We can set up a one-on-one meeting for that. You can use a general chat or the private chat if you'd like. Raise your hand feature. We'll be opening this up for Q&A after every slide, so you don't have to wait until the very end of the presentation to ask a question. Okay. Sharing my screen might be helpful for the actual presentation. Let me get to that. Okay. So Dave already did a bit of an introduction. My name is Amy Fisk. I'm the Assistant Dean for Accessibility, and I run the Accessibility Services Office on campus, formerly known as the Office of Disability Services. That department name change happened last spring, so in the spring of 2020. I joined the campus in February of 2020, so I've just celebrated my one-year work anniversary. Happy to be here at Geneseo. Crystal Purdy, also in on this call, is our administrative assistant, our testing center coordinator. She joined us in May of last year. So Crystal and I have been hard at work getting to know each other and getting to know the office together this past year. Kelleigh Larson, as Dave already mentioned, is our graduate intern, our accessibility coordinator, a name we've just decided to give it, who is also a Geneseo alum, and will be working in the office this semester and hopefully in future semesters. So a little bit about what we do. Some of this you may already know, that we are here to provide equal access to programs and services for our students with disabilities. Again, we do this by providing accommodations, we arrange services, address issues as they arise. So that might include physical accessibility concerns on campus. I work with a number of faculty and staff across campus and participate in other committees. So some of that work you might already be familiar with and why our office is here. The second part is promoting an inclusive campus environment. And so that first, what we do of providing equal access is more reflective of a traditional role of a disability services office, and just providing accommodations and getting out those letters of accommodations, making sure we're meeting compliance standards, both at the local, state, and federal levels. And although that's really important, and that's what we're here to do, beyond that, the field of disability services and higher ed in general is starting to shift to another focus of trying to promote an accessible campus environment, an inclusive and welcoming campus environment for students with disabilities, recognizing that disability is a really important facet of diversity. So I think in the past decade or so, colleges, including Geneseo, are placing a larger emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is a statement that we've heard over and over: diversity, equity, inclusion. It's in our mission, our values, and our strategic plan for this year. And often students with disabilities sometimes get left out of that conversation. And I think our field is beginning to recognize that and wanting to be an important part of making sure that that focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion should also include students with disabilities at the forefront of that. And recognizing that we have an institutional responsibility to support our students, to recognize any environmental barriers that we have, how we can be moving forward in best practice and how we teach, how we support students, how they live and learn on our campus, rather than just focusing on individual student deficits and how to accommodate, but rather trying to address environmental barriers on a more systems-wide scale. So again, that first, what we do with providing equal access, we continue to do that, but number two, promoting an inclusive campus environment is where we're wanting to go in the future. Okay, what is an accommodation? I'm not sure if any of you have come across this concept of equity versus equality. There's an image here of 3 individuals, and I wish there was some more diversity in the actual image, but some of the other ones were a little too K-12 for my liking. So this is an image of 3 individuals standing on what looks like a box or a crate. They're all different heights, and the image on the left is symbolic of equality. They are each standing on a crate of the same size, of the same height, right? And on the image on the left or on the right, excuse me, is showing a mirror image of that, except they're on different heights for the crate. Looks like the person in the middle has like a crate and a half, and then the third individual has 2 crates. So now they are all at the same height, okay? And so this image helps us understand the differences between equity and equality. And at face value, they might seem like the same term, right? Except equality says that we need to treat everyone the same. And at face value, that seems really important. Of course, we want to treat people the same, except that really ignores individual differences and also historical perspectives and the barriers that people tend to experience, especially from marginalized populations. Whereas equity says we are going to give the resources and appropriately so that everyone has the same opportunity to succeed. And this concept of equity and equality, I think, has been reflected in other social justice initiatives that have happened in our culture, especially in the past year. And I think it's really important to recognize that this can easily be applied in colleges and universities for students with disabilities. And so if we look at that image and we see the person who is standing on 2 crates, we might look at that as an accommodation, right? It's not an unfair advantage, right, for that one individual, but rather giving that person the same opportunity to have the same viewpoint, the same perspective, the same opportunity to succeed. The first image, it's not equal. They're still at different heights. And so what we're aiming for here is recognizing accommodation as leveling the playing field, making sure that everyone has the same opportunity to do well. Again, in accommodation at the college level, things are different in K-12, but here we're talking about college. It's not a modification of the curriculum and of our academic standards, but again, we're providing equal opportunity for all students to meet those standards. Again, what's an accommodation? These are determined purely on a case-by-case basis. Our next slide is going to go to the process of how a student would request an accommodation, just so you have some of that information. The accommodation should be based on individual needs, the content and format of the curriculum, the classroom environment. I made a note here that students should feel welcome to talk to you about their accommodations and needs. When I talk to students, whether it's one-on-one or through a survey that I conducted this past year on how COVID has really impacted them, a lot of students have said, I feel comfortable to varying degrees with my faculty. There are some faculty, they're afraid to talk about their needs, they're afraid to talk about their disability, and they're afraid to talk about their accommodations because they're fearful that their faculty are going to think that they're stupid, that they're trying to gain some kind of unfair advantage, to feel as though it's an inconvenience to accommodate them. And that's not what we want. We want to have a welcoming environment where students feel comfortable disclosing to their faculty to the extent that they're comfortable. And my student advocate had mentioned that in general, students know their strengths and their challenges. They're young adults now. They've been through the educational system. They know their strengths and challenges, and they know what they need to be successful. They need to be included in that decision making, but they also need to feel welcome in their classroom environment. So I think that's really important. I think most faculty know that students need to submit their letters of accommodation in order to receive accommodations. Otherwise, faculty don't know that they're eligible to receive them. So it's really important to include the Office of Accessibility syllabus statement. I included a hyperlink here, and of course this presentation will be made available after the end of the presentation, so you would be able to access that hyperlink. Our syllabus statement as of now is actually not required, but I'm hoping that will change. But I strongly recommend that you include it, not only from a liability perspective, but also to tell students that, that you recognize and appreciate that students might need to be accommodated in their classroom. Also try to remind students that if they have accommodations to please submit their letters. That can be a quick Canvas announcement at the beginning and maybe even mid-semester. Some students don't submit for two main reasons. One, they feel as though they're going to be stigmatized, or number two, they forget. Probably because of the nature of their disability, they might forget. And so putting out a quick reminder might be helpful. Just another quick note here that as faculty, you do reserve the right to contact our office if you have concerns regarding the reasonableness of the accommodation for your particular course. And you can certainly always contact me if you have questions or concerns about an accommodation. If you receive that letter and you're not quite sure what that would look like in your classroom, you reserve the right to come to me and have a conversation about that. So at this point, do we have any questions about what we've talked about so far?
Amy, can I add a couple of things?
Absolutely.
So one of the things I wanted to talk about was that first graphic of the individuals on the boxes is, you know, where you were saying that some individuals might think that it doesn't look equal because different people are in different size boxes. One thing to remember is each of those individuals, either now or historically, have had to take the initiative to step up onto that box. You know, it's not about lifting them up to that box. It's about recognizing where they're at right now in this moment. I also think that it's a very proactive approach, where oftentimes in the future we've had a more reactive approach. And so I think that's just good to keep in mind. And the other thing in regards to what you were just talking about is, you know, to remember that if you do have concerns, talk to the office first before you deny something, so that you make sure that you have all of the information and the office understands where your concerns lay before the student gets put in the middle.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate that perspective. Really important points. Another point that I missed on that graphic is that often when we think about disability, you know, what do we think about? Are we only thinking about physical disabilities? In that graphic, we see different heights. It's apparent that those individuals are at different places in the race, right? They have different heights. But disability is not just for individuals with more, for lack of a better term, apparent disabilities, right? Wheelchair users, perhaps, or individuals who are blind. or other more apparent disabilities, or those who might have a service dog. But we have to recognize disability is also, could be neurologically based, perhaps ADHD or autism, mental health. That's a huge one, right? Of individuals feel as though, and my students feel like this a lot, that just because they look fine, right, or seem to be doing fine on this day, but not this day, that somehow it's not as valid of a disability. And that's not true. We don't know each other's stories. And so that's why it's really important to again, be welcoming and not be making assumptions about your students. I think in general, students do try their best and are doing their best on a regular basis. And so we want to avoid making assumption. Any other thoughts or questions before I move on? Okay. So this is a list of some commonly provided accommodations. Again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but these are the accommodations that we provide most commonly. So that includes extended time on exams, a reduced distraction environment for exams, being able to use assistive technologies, having access to accessible textbook, and I'll talk about that in just a second, accessible housing, which might include a single room or an emotional support animal. Those are becoming more common. Back to the accessible textbooks, some individuals might use a screen reader that reads the text out loud, and especially for a physical textbook, they need to be able to have a screen reader or some other assistive technology read that aloud. So we make sure that it's in an electronic format or MP3 format or any kind of format that is accessible to that individual. And these are some of the accommodations that, per the survey that I put out to faculty in December, some of the accommodations that we'll be talking about today are based on the results of that survey of faculty wanting to learn more about some of these accommodations. Okay, the process for requesting accommodations. The requests are reviewed purely on a case-by-case basis. They must engage in an interactive process with me to request accommodations. So right now that includes completing a request form, whether that's academic or housing accommodations. They have to meet with me. Right now I'm just doing phone or Zoom appointments, but when we come back to in-person, hopefully I can invite students back into the office and submit documentation if I request it. This is a practice that has evolved in our office. I am not making documentation a prerequisite for requesting an accommodation. Sometimes obtaining documentation becomes an equity issue for some students, and I do not want that to become a barrier for being appropriately accommodated. So if a student comes to you and feels as though they have to have documentation or have to have this full-blown private neuro eval in order to even speak with me, that's not necessarily true. So if a student is feeling as though they're experiencing these barriers and they don't know what to do, just have them reach out to our office and we'll try to support them as best we can. And if they're approved for accommodations, they must share their letter of accommodation with you. Just as an aside, that particular practice might change, in that we're hoping to have a more automated process where letters are sent directly to faculty, as opposed to sending it to the student, then the student has to send it to the faculty member. We're looking to try to automate that to make that easier both on the student and the faculty member. So stay tuned with that. Any questions? I'm going to start playing the Jeopardy music. Okay, so let's get into some of these accommodations. Again, these are all based on the survey that was sent out to you by our Faculty Advisory Committee in December on the accommodations you had the most questions about. So extended time provides additional time to take any sort of timed assessment that has a discrete time limit. This is really important for students that struggle with taking exams within the scheduled time limit. So often we provide students with what we would call time and a half, or 50% time, or double time, or 100% time. So some reasons why students may need this accommodation: they have a real difficulty with just getting distracted, with being distracted, needing to use certain reading or writing strategies to get through the exam. Perhaps they have a learning disability. Again, the distraction piece, potentially ADHD, where they need to take many breaks. It might take either physical and or mental effort to write and type a response. I have students with obsessive-compulsive disorder that are really struggle with getting an exam in on the scheduled time because they're writing and rewriting or typing and retyping, right? And they just need that little extra time to get through. Taking time to employ coping strategies. A lot of students really struggle with a clinical level of anxiety during the exam and might need to take 5 minutes before and during the exam to just breathe, get up, go to the bathroom, and come back, use their coping strategies. So those are reasons why students might need to take extra time on an exam. Here's another hyperlink for a wiki on how to apply the extended time on Canvas. If you have more questions on that, our Canvas team, led by Joe Dolch, Becky Pat, and Lori Fox, they can certainly help you in navigating that process on Canvas. Just a point here that I've heard from some faculty, they say that they can look on Canvas and see that students may or may not be utilizing their full time, right? And what's up with that? Do they actually need it? And the question is, yes, they are connected with my office. They've provided the appropriate information to determine that this is an accommodation that is needed. Whether they use the full extended time or not completely depends on the situation. So for example, for students who have a chronic medical condition, a few of my students have said, there have been times where my symptoms are so debilitating that I'm either like running to the restroom during the test, or I'm really incredibly fatigued. I have to take breaks, and my symptoms ebb and flow. And that's true for a number of students with disabilities. And so there are times when maybe I can like fly through a quiz, or I can get something done within the scheduled time. And then there are other times that I can't, right? And so the barriers may or may not exist there. But the answer is yes, that they do need that extended time, and no, they're not using that time to cheat on the exam. That's another important point that I want to drive home. Any questions on this particular slide?
Amy, I would like to mention something on this too. I also think that it's important to recognize that sometimes students don't always disclose their disability. So even if they have a visible disability, they might also have something that's not visible that you don't know about. And so maybe that extended time isn't necessarily for the disability that you think it might be for. And I can give my own personal example is, as a blind individual, I can take most exams in the allotted time. However, I also have a neurological issue that most people don't know. And sometimes when I'm taking exams, if I have 3 or 4 little seizures during that exam that might only last a few seconds, it might take me 5 minutes to recover from that and refocus. And that can add up. And that might not happen every time, but it's going to be that one time that I don't have extended time that it's going to happen, because my stress level is going to be higher, which is going to increase that likelihood.
Thank you, Kelleigh. That's a really important point. Some more housekeeping items on this accommodation. Again, extended time applies whether it's a 10-minute quiz or a 2-hour final. If it has a discrete time limit and the student is being graded, it does need to apply. I put an asterisk here on the next sentence that it may not apply if the whole class is given a day or longer to complete something. This is I think one of the most highly asked questions, not only across faculty, but across disability services professionals as well, is, well, where's the cutoff, right, for providing extended time? My student, we're given 8 hours, and do I have to provide 16? If you have a question or concern about applying extended time, you can always contact our office, because it might be purely on a case-by-case basis. Again, the barriers that the student is experiencing might be different. So if a student has a chronic medical condition, yeah, having that extra time for breaks might be necessary. Or they might need to have a particular accommodation like a scribe, and it might take a lot longer. We might need to see if we can split the exam across 2 days instead, or find another alternative that meets the student's needs within reason. But my general rule of thumb is, if you're giving the whole class 24 hours or 2 or 3 days to complete something, that extended time may not be needed. But again, it completely depends on the student's needs and the format of the assessment. Another point, sometimes how long we think something is going to take versus how long it actually takes, for the students, sometimes doesn't necessarily align. We might say, oh, it should only take you 20 minutes, right? And the students are coming back and saying, no, actually it took me more like 30 or 40. I struggled with this. If you find that this is a pattern, consider collecting information on how long it took a student to complete an exam. So that can be kind of a short little assessment quiz, something on a discussion board, just asking how long something has taken, a quiz or an exam. And then when providing that same quiz or exam for future classes or for that same class, you can have a better understanding of how long that might take students. I think that's an important part here. Just some notes about testing practices that may not be the most accessible. Pop quizzes, that is something that is really difficult, if not impossible, to imply an accommodation for, because students, especially those who have a reduced distraction environment accommodation, they have to make their testing appointments 3 days in advance. And so they wouldn't be able to make arrangements for their testing center if it was a pop quiz. And quizzes at the beginning of class can be really tough, because again, students with extended time, is that cutting in on lecture? Maybe that's inherently outing the student that they have accommodations when you're timing the rest of the class, and then have a separate timer for other students. And we want to avoid that. So some alternatives could be allowing the student to maybe take that quiz like after class, providing extra time another way, a quiz maybe like outside of the classroom environment, a quick like pre or post class quiz that they can take on their own time, before or after class, instead of a pop quiz when they come in. So those are just some important considerations there. Any questions on this slide? Ooh, I thought there would be a lot of questions on that particular one. No problem. Okay, the reduced distraction environment. Often this means students taking the exam in the testing center, providing a quiet space for them to take a test. It's very important for students who struggle to take their in-person exams in the classroom. A lot of students, two main things I see are students with ADHD. They really struggle with distraction in the classroom. A lot of sounds, students getting up, the tapping of the pencils or the typing on the keyboard can really distract them throughout the exam. Students with anxiety indicate that they see that, oh God, my classmates are getting up, I'm gonna be the last one to take the exam. And it's very anxiety provoking, and then it prevents them from actually taking the exam. And so those are a few. We also might have students who require a scribe. So that means that one of our testing center proctors typing out or writing out their verbatim responses if they have difficulty physically typing or writing something out. And so it might take a little more time for that. So our testing center is located in Irwin Hall. Right now I'm in my office. We're at the lower level of Irwin Hall. This semester we're at reduced capacity, just making sure that we're social distancing. We're open Monday through Friday, 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. Those hours have been reduced a little bit. So the earliest that a student can take an exam is at 11. They still have to schedule their exams or quizzes at least 3 days ahead of time through our online portal. A few points here: students taking an online exam with extended time do not need to make an appointment with us at the testing center in order to get their extended time. Unless somehow other students in the course are being proctored remotely, we can make arrangements for remote proctoring if needed. We've done it this semester, but in general, if other students in the class are not being proctored, you shouldn't have to have your students with accommodations be proctored. And if they don't want to take it in the testing center, that they don't have to. So again, students taking an online exam with extended time do not need to make an appointment at the testing center. Also, even for in-person exams, students can make a separate arrangement with faculty if they prefer to take their exam near the instructor. I've had a number of students who say, I need that extended time, but I like to be in or near the classroom, even if it's like an instructor's office hours, and they make separate arrangements with the faculty, and the faculty are fine with that. So students reserve the right to do that. There's more information on testing center procedures right on our website. There's a tab that has testing center guidance for faculty. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll move on. Audio recording. Okay. So this accommodation is important for students who need assistance capturing material for synchronous class sessions. So that can mean in person or online via Zoom. Important for students who take longer processing verbal information. Also, students who become easily distracted or who on occasion need to step out of the classroom. So that's an important accommodation. In addition, students might need note-taking assistance. So some note-taking assistive technology might include an audio recording component. And so again, as of the fall 2021 semester, if students have an accommodation of audio recording, they will be provided with an audio recording agreement, just indicating that they will not share the audio recording information. So that one's kind of a short slide, but back to the note-taking part, we are in the process of trying to update our assistive technology within our office to provide a little bit more support for our students, and that would include note-taking software that has an audio recording component. We're just finding that the peer note takers, although they may be essential for certain students with particular needs and accommodations, we're finding that it's inefficient and ineffective, both practically and in terms of cost. So if we want to try to find some software and technology that can be, one, cost-effective and efficient, and then number two, better for the students. And it gives them the opportunity to be more in control of their own content and their own notes. I see we have a raised hand for one of our participants, Dr. Paku.
Hi, yeah, I have a question about this one. Have you, do you have thoughts about how to balance audio recording as an accommodation with the possibility that the material in the class might be sensitive and that students in the class might not want to disclose? Or that other students in the class might not want it recorded?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question, and one I've gotten a few times. When it's an accommodation, the deference goes to the student with the accommodation. In terms of having the audio recorded sessions, they need equal access to that class material It depends also on the nature and the level of sensitivity of information. If this is something that students are disclosing extremely personal information, and there are students who may not be comfortable being audio recorded, it might be helpful to make an announcement to the class to just say, we will be audio recording, or again, if it's part of universal design, you'll be audio recording your sessions. And instead of pointing out that there are certain students with accommodations, just to mention that your sessions are generally recorded. They may be recorded if someone feels uncomfortable with that, to indicate when that student might turn off their audio recording for really sensitive personal information, and just give the class the ability to indicate if they feel really uncomfortable with it. And then we might ask the student to stop recording at a certain period of time, and then to resume recording when it's appropriate. But in general, unless other students are indicating they're uncomfortable with being recorded based on highly sensitive or personal information, the deference goes to the individual who has the accommodation. Plus, New York State, I believe we would call that a kind of a one-party state. We can just in general record, but especially if it's an accommodation, it's important that the individual gets that classroom content, unless another student in the class has specifically said they don't feel comfortable for maybe one particular class, right? That you're talking about really sensitive information. And then there's some way to indicate when the student can begin resuming their recording.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Also in this, one, if a student is disclosing that much of personal information, is it appropriate for them to be disclosing that? And even if it's not being recorded, anyone in that course could be writing down what they're saying word for word. So whenever a person discloses any information, you can't guarantee confidentiality. You can only guarantee confidentiality on yourself, but you have no control over what the rest of the class is doing.
That's a good point. Thank you, Kelleigh. Any other questions or concerns, thoughts about that? Okay. Captioning and transcripts. So this is something that hasn't come up in conversation a lot until we had the shift to remote learning. And there are some implications for that. Typically, students who were approved for this accommodation, this was in reference to making sure that any audio video content, including YouTube videos that were played in class, making sure to enable that closed captioning tab, or a documentary or some other video content was captioned. Now that there has been a shift to remote learning, and that a lot of video content is being produced through Zoom lectures, pre-recorded lecture videos, there has been a greater implication for this accommodation. So whenever you see this on a letter of accommodation, this means that you may have to provide some titles for either live and or pre-recorded video content. I want to mention here that this largely varies on individual student need. I have had students that say, as long as everyone else stays muted and I can hear the instructor clearly, I don't have an issue. And the live transcript feature is really great for a lot of students. I've had other students who do need that live human transcription service, in which case our office would coordinate that particular service. The pre-recorded video content, if you're creating a video, making sure that when you put it on YouTube, you're enabling the closed caption feature and the audio description feature as well. So that's important. Just a note here that even though, yes, we need to coordinate services and provide captions for individuals who have it on a letter of accommodation, not only useful for students with hearing impairments, but also really helpful for individuals with learning disabilities, students whose English is not their first language, those in a cafe or a bus station in a very noisy or distracting environment. It can be helpful for just about anyone. I don't know about you, but shamelessly, I have turned them on for professional development webinars. So that I can do other work on the side, and then I'll say, whoop, hold on, that was important. And I advert my attention back to the webinar, and I can read through the transcript to see what I may have missed. I've had a lot of students who they're in a household with 4 other siblings who are also remote learning, and it is hard for them to hear even with headphones. I've had students working in Crickets here on Main Street. They're in a cafe. And when we have meetings and when they're in classes, having that live transcription is really helpful. Our ed tech team has put together a fantastic wiki on using the live transcription feature on your Zoom account. It's already been enabled, the feature has already been enabled in your account setting, but when you go into beginning a Zoom class, all you have to do is click enable live transcription and it should pop up on the bottom of the screen. And then you are able to save a full transcription of the meeting and save it right onto your computer as a text file. I have had many students with learning disabilities and ADHD who find this transformative because when they get distracted, when they get anxious, they look back at that transcription and they use it also as their notes. It's been huge for many of my students. Again, another guide for enabling closed caption in YouTube. Check to see if captions are available for other assigned video material like documentaries. The library can help you with that as well if you're looking for accessible video content. Just another note that if students require specialized captioning services, again, that can include edited captions in case the automatic captioning is not sufficiently accurate, or if they need that live human transcription service, we will coordinate that with the student. So in summary, making sure that you use that live transcription feature when you're in a synchronous class, and if you have pre-recorded video content, to make sure that it captions are enabled in YouTube. Do I see a raised hand? I think. Yes, Kelly.
So I just recently went to a STEM conference, and this was something that they talked about that's invaluable to individuals who are on the autistic spectrum. And the woman who presented was autistic. She's an engineer, and she was talking about like her experience and the fact that currently it's 11 to 15% of individuals that have some of these issues. And one of the things that she was talking about was processing. And she was saying that individuals in this population have the capacity for the information. They have the intelligence and the knowledge, but they don't have the processing speed. And so you can ask, you know, a couple of questions. Her example was 3. You ask 3 questions, and while they're processing those questions, they go through a whole kind of thought process that happens. And by the time they get through that, they have forgotten what the original initiative was, the original question. And so having something where they can read back, or you can ask them the question again, is very beneficial. And so just to keep that in mind, that it's not always something that is evident, but something that might be happening internally just in that processing, and being able to read back over that gives them that opportunity to hear that question a second time instead of having to raise their hand and say, could you repeat that? Because it makes them seem like they're not really paying attention when they are. They just need to have it again.
Thank you, Kelly. Absolutely. Okay. Okay, so another accommodation that faculty have indicated they have a lot of questions about. I think that was our number one, saving the best for last. The accommodation of flexible due dates and modified attendance. So this accommodation is a little more complex than some of the other accommodations, and it's needed for students who, due to the episodic nature of their disability, which we are often provide for individuals with severe mental health and medical conditions, may on occasion miss a class, they need to make up an exam or quiz, or they might need a slight assignment extension. It should be applied on a course-by-course basis, very much depending on the course format and learning objectives. So for example, a upper level bio lab or a senior level teaching placement is going to look different and have different levels of objective than maybe a first year lecture where there are 100 other students and they can access information easily on Canvas if they have to miss, or that there's some level of flexibility in when they can submit an assignment or an exam. So again, should be on a course-by-course basis. Just a note here that policies and flexibility provided to all students in the course, right, which is listed in the syllabus, should be taken into consideration as well. So for example, there might be some courses that say you're allowed to submit 10 out of 14 assignments, right? So like 4 are not graded, right? And so there's already some built-in flexibility for students. And so the extent to which a student with a disability needs to be further accommodated, you might have to relook at that versus where there's like zero flexibility provided in the class. That's important. Another piece, it depends on the pacing and the format of the course. If your course is set up like a lab, right? Or another course where the pacing is such that something is due on a weekly basis because the information prior, it builds and it is sequential in nature, that might be more difficult to give a student like several days to extend an assignment, but rather, maybe 1 to 2 days extra maximum is considered reasonable for that course. And again, for attendance, if there's a lab and you miss like half the course sessions, that's going to be difficult for you to learn content in the course. So it may not be reasonable. But if you're thinking about what kind of flexibility is given to all students, that might help with your decision making with the student and what is considered reasonable and what flexibility is already built in. Okay. With that, again, there needs to be an interactive discussion with the faculty and the student and or our office. When a student is approved for this accommodation, students are provided with, right now, what is called a modified attendance / flex due date form. That form is meant to serve as a guideline between the student and the faculty member in how many days they're reasonably allowed to miss, how many days after a due date they may submit an assignment, and how to get a hold of the faculty member by phone or email, whatever the faculty's preference is, if they have to get an assignment extension, if they're going to miss class, etc. There needs to be an interactive discussion with the faculty and the student. The trouble with this accommodation is there's kind of there's a power differential piece here that some students feel really concerned about talking to their faculty and are not comfortable with that, in which case, or the faculty member is uncomfortable with engaging in that conversation and in that negotiation, in which case our office is here to facilitate that conversation. As of now, I don't have the staffing to reach out to every single faculty member proactively for every single student, for every single semester, for every single course, given the students that have been pre-approved for this accommodation as of now. So I am in the process of writing policy for this accommodation so that there's some more clarity and guidelines for both students and faculty and that is set to be ready by the fall 2021 semester. So that is coming. I am consulting with legal and looking into best practices and what other institutions are doing to appropriately address this policy, again, so that there's more clarity and guideline for both student and faculty. If you have concerns about how this accommodation relates to this course, we are here to help. We're here to help with that discussion. An important point to make here that I always talk to students about is that this accommodation is not meant to be a replacement for time management. It's not meant to be a blanket allowance for continual late submissions. It's meant to be a safety net for our students who might miss a class or an exam or an assignment deadline for a very specific disability related reason and need to be given a bit of a safety net beyond if flexibility is not already provided to the rest of the class. It's not meant to be, yeah, sure, you can hand something in like a week late. If a student is not meeting the learning objectives, if they are not submitting assignments, not providing notice that they need an extension, then that goes beyond the scope of this accommodation. And a student might come to us or the faculty member might come to us and say, I have a lot of concern about the student's progress in the class. And then we might consult with the student to identify what are the barriers here, how can we help. We might advise them to meet with an academic peer mentor if they need help with coming up with a homework plan on a weekly basis, or if they're really far behind, to maybe advise them a different direction to maybe take the course another semester or take another course. So that's something to think about. Any questions on this particular accommodation?
One thing I think that is important here is that this is something that this office has taken very seriously. Even just over the last couple weeks, I've had a couple students who do not have this accommodation come to me and say, well, what do I do? Like, I didn't get this assignment or that assignment turned in. And I'm like, well, you can't ask for an accommodation after the fact, for one. But for two, you always can talk to your professor, but you, one, need to take responsibility, and two, you need to make it clear that you understand this is not an accommodation. You can ask if you can turn something in late, but that, you really need to recognize that your professor can say no, and you can give options, but that this is, a boundary issue and also a accommodation issue. And it's not something that is just given after the fact.
Thank you, Kelly. I will likely do another workshop reviewing this policy on its own in the fall. So stay tuned for that. Because I can't help myself, a slide on accommodations and universal design. Okay. Although providing accommodations and equal access is very important, it's what we do within our office. Recognizing that accommodation in and of itself is reactive, right? The student has to identify in our office. They have to disclose as being an individual the disabilities. We're making individual adjustments. Whereas the concept of access, right, accessibility is proactive. We're giving all individuals the opportunity to access information more fully. So I have a chart here, a table that on the left has listed just a few accommodations that we provide. And on the right is a column of some UDL practices. Whenever I say UDL practice, I just mean more accessible, practices for individuals. So for example, the first line, we have an accommodation of accessible text format. What that means is that a student has to purchase the textbook. We then contact the publisher, get an alternative format of that text, which could take weeks. Then we send the file over onto the instructor. It's a time-intensive process, right? And in which case the student can already become behind in the course. What's a good practice for being a little more proactive consider assigning a digital or ebook version of the book, or including that version of the book in the syllabus so that the student can get it right there. There are a number of platforms that provide ebook versions of textbooks. I think ReadShelf or RedShelf and VitalSource are some good ones. Making sure that your PDF readings are tagged, they're accessible, utilizing Blackboard Ally. Contact our ed tech team for help if you're like, yeah, I don't even know where to start with that. Contact our ed tech team. They can go step by step and do some document remediation for you. And I just came across this cool subscription from Natural Reader where I can add you as faculty members as a user, and then you can upload your PDF documents and they can become automatically OCR'd. That's a fancy way of saying that they would be more readable using assistive technologies and they would be more accessible. So if you'd like to be added as a user, I'm happy to add you as one. We have it for free, yay, until February of next year. So you can always reach out to me if that's something you might be interested in, if you have a lot of digital readings. Again, audio recording of lectures. Consider recording your online synchronous class meetings and posting them on Canvas, allowing any student, whether they have a disability or not, to use technology to take notes in the class. Extended time on exams. Depending on the course objectives, consider an untimed assessment or projects, papers, any other alternative method for your students' ability to demonstrate their knowledge. Note takers, again, being able to use assistive technology, providing notes on Canvas in advance. Then the student may not need peer note takers as an accommodation. Just a thought here that in our shift to remote learning, a lot of these strategies and practices have become essential, not just for students with disabilities, but for anyone learning remotely. Students who are trying to balance school and life, right? A lot of students are struggling with that. Those in quarantine can't come to class. Trying to attend class and do homework in a really distracting home environment. Those who have really poor Wi-Fi or are having financial difficulties and can't access the resources on campus they've been able to access before. These are real situations that our students are dealing with, whether they're connected with our office or not. And so the more accessible practices and technologies and materials that you're able to provide, it would benefit your whole classroom, not just students connected with our office. I'm giving this an opportunity for any additional Q&A that anyone else might have about accommodations or what we do within our office, how to support our student. I know we're 2 minutes past